Hello. I'm a traveller and a storyteller, so truth is a constant concern for me. On my research trips, whether on foot, by bus, or aboard a Boeing Dreamliner, I meet people, make observations, and collect stories. A parallel journey, equally real to me, is then made back at home. There, the experience and memories of my journey are drawn together and distilled in a process that is inevitably partial and impressionistic. The interplay of these two realities, on the road and onto the page, creates the opportunity to compose a narrative that combines facts and feelings, a traveller's tale that's shaped in part by an instinctive need to infuse the moment with meaning and value. My objective has always been to evoke empathy. In my work, I try to access the internal worlds of living people who I've met or the dead who I want to portray. I imagine myself into their lives so that the reader can better understand them and their time. I use stories to draw the reader into another world. So, at my desk, I ruminate on reportage and incomplete field notes. I reflect on the fleshing out of character, on how to make a person live on the page from what was and what wasn't said in an interview. I've realised, over more than a dozen books, that people tell and retell themselves stories to shape their lives, as nations do to shape their histories. I've understood that accounts of the past, both individual and collective, are created and used to mould the present and future. Hence, I have come to see all our histories as constructions, both because of the subjectivity of experience and because the historical record is never complete. The gaps in it, between known facts and in flaws of memory, have always needed to be filled in. That means every history we've heard or told ourselves involves narration of one kind or another, composed of or for its time, created without true objectivity. This thinking is hardly new. In ancient Greece, the philosopher Plutarch wrestled with the elusiveness of the concept of truth. He grasped that every experience could be recounted in an infinite variety of ways, explaining the contradictory interpretations of events in his histories by writing that some say this happened in the past, others say it was that. The English novelist William Golding went further, venturing that, quote, "Courteous historians will generally concede that since no one can describe events with perfect accuracy, written history is a branch of fiction." The American cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus then suggested that memory itself can be a fiction. Her research revealed that details of recalled events can be changed, that memories of events that never even happened can be planted in the mind. Which brings me to Russia and us. Russians have always told powerful stories, and I'm not talking about Chekhov, Golgoy, and Tolstoy. Since the first days of their great revolution, they have told whoppers about Lenin and the people, Stalin and the Great Patriotic War, the visionary KGB officer who rises to power to save the motherland. Today, their stories, their debasing of truth with persuasive and seductive fictions, have reached beyond their borders to help to poison our own tenuous hold on truth. 30 years have passed since I made my original Stalin's Nose journey from Berlin to Moscow at the dawn of a new age. In 1989, Eastern Europe had risen up against its Red Army occupiers and sent them packing. The fall of the wall was followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union. 70 years of totalitarianism ended almost overnight, the Europeans embracing the idea of a borderless continent, believing that they had changed the world. In those euphoric days, I explored lands that were, for most of us Westerners, the forgotten half of Europe. In East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Romania and Russia, I met people who hadn't spoken to a foreigner in decades, who opened their hearts and told me stories of lost years, ruined lives, and secret policemen. In Czechoslovakia, I heard Václav Havel, the imprisoned playwright who'd become president, herald the birth of, quote, a Europe in which no one more powerful will be able to suppress anyone less powerful, in which it will no longer be possible to settle disputes by force. How could it be otherwise? My generation had grown up in the shadow of the Second World War, haunted by the ghosts of 60 million dead. We'd come of age during the Cold War, with half a continent imprisoned behind a wall. Our response was to value individual liberty above tribalism. We couldn't have borne the loss of more fathers and uncles to see our brothers die in the name of the old demons. So we celebrated when former adversaries drew back the Iron Curtain. We applauded as East and West Germans danced together in no man's land. We embraced the strengthening of international understanding and institutions. 30 years on, I've retraced my original journey backwards to ask what became of our faith in the power of openness and reconciliation. Why, after that promising dawn, has the Kremlin redoubled its efforts to undermine Western unity? And how could so many of us have fallen for the populists' lies and spin, for untruths dragging democracy to this precarious moment? To answer those questions, I'd like to tell you a couple of stories. Imagine, if you will, a blistering hot August afternoon. Moscow in summer is like a pressure cooker, shimmering with heat, its residents ready to explode. Sirens echo off Stalinist skyscrapers. Fuming policemen swagger across the broad boulevards, their truncheons knocking against their jackboots. Me? I'm in air-conditioned cool, heading out of town in a convoy of top-of-the-line Range Rovers. My host is Russia's chicken czar, Dmitri, a 50-something oligarch about whom there is something magnetic, something mercurial, and something seriously shady, too. You can picture Dmitri beside me on the hand-tooled Windsor leather backseat. Hooded blue eyes, black hair, crew cut short, his vowels dark, his voice as thick as tar. He's wearing a Savile Row blazer and flashy diamond ring that hints at both flair and vulgarity. Dmitri made his money in bush legs, and he wanted me to ghostwrite his story, even to turn it into a movie. I'll now read an extract from Pravda Haha. Sorry for my English bleeding your ears, but you are writer. He picked a hair off his baby blue Jaeger cashmere jumper. I tell you my story and you write it. Understand? When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, Russians started to starve. In response, the European community donated much of its butter mountain and milk lakes to the Rump Empire. The Salvation Army, banned during the communist years, opened hundreds of soup kitchens. And George H.W. Bush flooded the place with chicken. Never before had anyone seen such beautiful fat legs, not even on their own babushka, recalled Dmitri, making a crude gesture with his manicured hands. To hungry Russians, the plump, pink thighs and drumsticks were manna from heaven, or at least from Kansas. With their gift for wit and repartee, they dubbed the phosphate-filled imports bush legs. I tell you, my childhood was grey. Grey clothes, grey school, grey pot of cabbage on cooker, recalled Dmitri. His words seemed to be formed at the back of his mouth, stumble across his tongue, and then tip, syllable by syllable, over his lips. When glorious Soviet Union went to dog, people suddenly can buy everything they ever dreamed of, like bananas. To get them, they started to hustle, selling salami, vodka, women. Me? I was 19-year-old. I wanted to be rich. I wanted to escape grey. So I sold chicken. I made office in my uncle's apartment. I slept on floor. And no matter how much I sold, no matter how much I charged, people wanted more. More and more bush legs, which I kept in courtyard and freezer truck. In 1 month, I bought myself cordless telephone. I was so proud. In 3 months, I bought apartment. In 1 year, I had my first factory. Now I send my nephew to school at Eton. Across Russia, hundreds of similar stories can be told of brazen opportunism, criminal acumen, and amenable relatives in the KGB, of power and property falling into private hands, further weakening the state. As Dmitri put it, in the 1990s, anyone with balls and the right connections could bag a couple of oil wells. Few of us appreciate today the turmoil of the early 1990s. Russia's gross domestic product fell by half, more than America's during the Great Depression. Bank savings were wiped out by inflation. Male life expectancy crashed to 57 years, the lowest in the industrial world. People struggled to survive, asking if there was such a thing as right and wrong, while criminals lorded it over their streets and the Kremlin. There is a story from those days of 2 mafia gangs vying to blackmail the same bank. The banker made it known that he'd pay protection money only to the stronger of the 2. To prove themselves worthy, the first gang set about kneecapping its opponents. The second gang opted to use brains rather than brawn. It scooped a homeless drunk off the streets, cleaned him up, dressed him in designer clothes, and put it about that he was the head of an especially ruthless third gang. He was seen in the best restaurants, spotted buying serious weapons from a KGB fence, and overheard boasting about the annihilation of the competition. Then, with the scene set and in full sight of the banker, the second gang executed the drunk in cold blood. Some say that he was roasted to death in a burning Mercedes. Others that he was buried up to the neck and decapitated with a scythe. But no matter how the poor man met his end, the ruthlessness of the second gang so impressed the banker that he chose them. This turmoil, this crushing of certainties, shattered ordinary Russians. You see, for generations, they had been fed a story, the great communist myth. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the flag was lowered for the last time, it took with it the illusion of a people's utopia. Moscow, once portrayed as a proletarian paradise, became the global capital of inequality, and Russians found themselves with no ideology to cling to and no vision for the future. In their despair, in the absence of a positive new narrative, people began to long for their Soviet past. Their nostalgia was cleverly manipulated through the newspapers and TV stations of the new elite into a mythologized version of history, deifying Stalin, welcoming the restoration of the Soviet national anthem, printing school textbooks that glorified the Red Army, dismissing, for example, forced labor and the gulags as the unavoidable cost of modernization. Enemies were said to surround Russia again. The West was revived as an aggressor. If the nation stood up against them, Russia could be great again. Russians, like many of us in the West when confronting traumatic change, lost their appetite for hard truths, choosing to champion leaders who tell them a single emotive story. Now, if you will, please picture a dead-straight Leningrad street lined by workers' tenements. It's 1973, and Russia is transfixed by a television series called 17 Moments of Spring. It tells the story of a handsome KGB agent armed with steel nerves and a cool demeanor who exposes a Nazi plot to negotiate peace with the Western Allies. No matter that no such spy or plot existed, the series, in which wartime newsreels mutated into fiction, was perceived as historical fact. Almost every viewer came to believe that Russia had been betrayed. Almost no one knew that 17 Moments of Spring, Russia's most popular television program ever, was conceived and commissioned by the KGB. Its purpose? To encourage young, educated recruits to join the security service. On that dead straight Leningrad street, at number 12, a young man is gazing in awe at the dashing hero figure, his eyes fixed on the screen, his palms sweaty with excitement. He wants to be a Soviet James Bond, subduing enemies, filled with glory. He has already walked into the KGB's headquarters and been instructed how to prepare for service. Within a year or two, he will join the organization. Now, put that in context with the fall of the wall. Think of the boy's father, who'd served in both the Red Army and an NKVD destruction battalion. Think of his mother, who had collapsed from hunger during the siege of Leningrad. Think of that young man in 1990, driving home from East Germany, where he'd served as a KGB officer, to the crumbling Soviet Empire, haunted by the loss of purpose and pride. Was his family's sacrifice his effort all for nothing? He calls the collapse of the Soviet Union, with its history of state terror and death camp gulags, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He is filled with redemptive purpose. He is determined to restore Russia's power. He declares, "It is time for Russia to get off its knees," and sets about spinning false narratives. Vladimir Putin is that KGB officer. But when he comes to power, he has a problem. His Russia has almost no money, thanks to the thieving oligarchs and the 2008 financial crisis. He builds new missiles, yes, but he needs something else. He needs, and I quote, "a weapon that is very cheap, almost free of charge, but can affect a huge amount of people, as can nuclear weapons." For the last decade or so, the so-called Internet Research Agency has waged war on democracy by hacking our emotions. On Facebook and Twitter, its operatives propagate whopping lies, linking pornography to Russian opposition politicians, slamming liberals in comments, championing Brexit. Bots, short for robots, then forward these personal comments to countless fake accounts, making them trend by manipulating Google's algorithms. The agency's success has been breathtaking. During the 2016 US presidential election, its 80,000 Facebook posts, replete with inflammatory images, were seen by 126 million Americans. On the day of the Brexit referendum, 3,800 fake accounts were mobilized to tweet the hashtag reasons to leave EU. Quote, "Migrants rape 13-year-old Russian girl in Berlin." Lie. "EU to ban baptism." Lie. "Florida school shooter shouts Arabic phrases before killing spree." Untrue. We can hardly imagine what they are posting now, ahead of November. But we do know that their every tweet, meme, video, and deep fake photograph has been designed to sow distrust, to exacerbate division, and to discredit truth. I trace these and other stories and their effect across the pages of my book, Pravda Ha-Ha, Truth, Lies, and the End of Europe. I travel in revanchist Russia, meet and play video games with a former Internet Research Agency cyber hacker, head to a liberal Hungary and Poland, wait for Mikhail Gorbachev on the shores of Lake Geneva, then cross Germany to reach Brexit Britain. As Europe sleepwalks into a perilous new age, I explore how opportunists, from Putin to English and American populists, have made a joke of truth, and examine the veracity of historical narrative from reportage to fiction and fake news. In my books, I tell stories. I select and tailor experience into scenes and set pieces. I arrange the action to give the narrative shape and momentum. I develop characters modeled on living originals, unlike those in many novels. I hear, or hear again, their voices in my head. I aim for a greater truth through the use of facts to make a person, people, place, or history more accessible to the reader and to myself, so the reader, or myself, can better understand the human condition. I want to empower, not weaken, by bridging gaps, by evoking our communality. Of course, I'm constrained by history's obligation to strive for truth, as well as my sense of duty to the individuals who spoke to me, often at great risk to themselves. I will not misrepresent them or their world. I must honor them and their trust in me. Perhaps this might make me seem like an unreliable narrator, Certainly I am no cool and objective reporter, but I'm not suggesting that fiction is more real than fact. I'm not arguing that reality is relative. Rather, I am warning, through my books, as a sincere, thinking wordsmith, against the seduction of simplistic interpretation. Stories bring us understanding, insight, and revelation. They can be a solace, a joy, a means of escape. They can fire our imagination and stir us into action. They can also delude us. How then, as mercenary fictions are spun to revise reality, can we maintain our trust in the noble illumination of narrative? How should we respond as our behaviour and beliefs are manipulated by those who lack moral purpose, who fire up nostalgic fantasies, peddle propaganda, and muddle our vision of the future? For me, it starts with the individual and his intention at their desk, on the street, in front of her screen. It starts with bold humility. As we stumble through this post-truth age, we all, as individuals, as nations, need to be truth seekers, calling out dishonesty, arrogance, and narcissism, steering clear of hyper-polarized dead ends. Above all, we must find the courage to stop falling for simplistic ideas that masquerade as truth. Don't lie, the Nobel laureate Alexander Solzhenitsyn once wrote in an open letter to the Russian people. Don't participate in lies. Don't support a lie. In bold humility, we must strive for integrity, for empathy, for balance. By acknowledging that history is a collection of stories, an individual can shape it, own it, and take responsibility for it. Every one of us has an ear for a false note, a nose for a lie. We are innately aware of artifice and quacks. We are capable of sniffing out simplistic fictions and countering the lies. The more we realize that the history we are telling or reading or hearing is a story, a truth, the more we can together come closer to the truth. To finish, I'd like to tell you about Christina, the Warsaw doctor who stopped, briefly, a march of 70,000 nationalists. 30 years ago, when we first met, Christina had protested against the Soviet occupation, in defiance of martial law, by printing banned literature. Across the country, hundreds of brave souls like her had taken huge risks to drive the Russians out of Poland. Truth-telling, as she told me at our first meeting, could have cost them their lives. But today, she is back on the streets. That November, Christina and 13 other women joined Warsaw's annual Independence Day March. Around them gathered thousands of young couples, old patriots, families on holiday, and a core of ultranationalists. As soon as the march began, the extremists slid in from the fringes, chanting, "White Europe! Clean blood! Pure Poland!" They insinuated themselves into the crowd, igniting flares to cast the square into smoky crimson light, filling the air with aggression. Christina and her tiny group walked with a furled banner near the front of the 70,000 marchers. At the place where wide Jerusalem Avenue narrows onto a bridge, her group, who ranged in age from 19 to 73 years old, turned to face the crowd. They unfurled their long banner and blocked the march. "Stop fascism!" it read in bold, hand-painted letters. Around them, the crowd juddered to a stop. Two nationalists immediately tried to tear away the banner, so the women, wearing woolly hats and Polish armbands, sat down on the pavement. Skinheads cursed them as terrorists, whores, enemies of Poland. A man in battle fatigues radioed for backup, and within 2 or 3 minutes, half a dozen heavies in balaclavas mustered around them. "Down with fascism!" the women shouted again and again. In their anger, 2 of the hooded men started to drag them away, pulling on parka hoods, grabbing arms and legs. One of them, Cassia, was dropped, hit her head and lost consciousness. Another, Elsbetia, was kicked repeatedly in her back. The others again broke free, linked arms and lay down together to sing Prayer at Sunrise, their voices quivering with fear. In response, the men began to spit at them, shouting more right-wing slogans, their rage drowning out the women's chants. "Death to you, enemies of Poland! Glory to Greater Poland!" In the crowd, most families and couples looked on, passive and unthinking. Some laughed, 1 or 2 snapped photographs. Others simply turned away. "I have never been so frightened in my life," said Christina later. "We were alone. Of course we didn't stop the march. Of course the protest was symbolic. But we proved that the neo-fascists had stolen Independence Day." Yet Christina's courageous protest went unreported in Poland's newspapers and on government-controlled channels, despite having been filmed by a national television cameraman. No Pole outside her small circle knew it. It was expunged from the national narrative. "Freedom can't be taken for granted," Christina told me, back on the street, fighting once again for her beliefs, for democracy. "We all have to be vigilant. We all have to be ready to act." 30 years ago, I travelled across Eastern Europe with the certainty of a young man, living by certain principles, prizing certain values. Over the years, those certainties, those ethics, have sustained me. I have continued to live by them as much as possible. But in 1989, 11 countries had border walls or fences. Today, there are more than 70 around the world. At the dawn of another new age, in this time of radical uncertainty, we, teachers, students, readers, and writers need to find a way of keeping faith in tolerance, empathy, and truth. Thank you.